It is 1947, somewhere in the Pacific. Against all odds, 6 men have embarked on a remarkable voyage and a breakthrough scientific experiment. In a primitive balsa wood raft, exposed to the fury of the open seas, they are attempting to cross 4,300 miles of ocean. Few believe they'll return alive. Their leader is Thor Heyerdahl. The Non-Tiki expedition, a bold and controversial first step in a lifelong quest to discover how ancient man traveled the globe. Heyerdahl's passion for the mysteries of early man would take him all over the world, recreating the hazardous journeys he believed were made many centuries ago, and risking his life to prove early man could have made the same voyage. He is a pioneer scientist, a trailblazing sailor, explorer, and adventurer who challenged the forces of nature and rewrote the history of ancient man.
I think he's one of the great adventurers of our time. He's a true explorer and also a great scientist.
I think an interesting side of my father's personality is that he is a blend between a scientist, an artist, and a philosopher.
He said, well, I've never crossed an ocean willingly in my entire life. I've only crossed the oceans because I've had to.
As a boy growing up in Norway, Heyerdahl was fascinated by the Pacific Ocean, often drawing his fantasies about life in the tropical South Seas. A confirmed landlubber who as a child feared and avoided the water, he led a solitary and quiet life, turning at an early age to books and reading everything he could find about exotic locations around the world. Later, studying zoology and geography, he wondered about man's earliest migrations to remote parts of the world. Who were the first visitors to these tiny specks of land? Where had they come from? And how had they made such hazardous journeys? In 1937, Heyerdahl, a young scientist just out of university, went to Polynesia to find out. He traveled to the remote island of Fatuhiva with his young wife to study plant and animal life and fulfill his boyhood dream of escaping civilization. He was immediately startled by similarities with vegetation that could only have come from South America. Could they be clues to Polynesia's mysterious past? It was here Heyerdahl first imagined ancient people riding the trade winds in primitive boats from South America across the Pacific to Polynesia. It was a revolutionary idea that would change his life and set off a raging controversy throughout the scientific community for years to come.
When I was sitting talking to the old people who knew the traditional history, I was amazed when they pointed exactly to those plants which I knew as a biologist had been brought by man, and they said they had been brought by their ancestors from the sunrise. So I started really to take a little more faith in what we call mythology, which in reality very often is traditional history.
At the time, the experts were convinced the earliest settlers in Polynesia came from Asia, sailing east. For ancient sailors, without the benefit of modern navigational equipment, to have come to Polynesia all the way from South America was dismissed as utterly impossible. For Heyerdahl, the evidence was becoming too strong to dismiss. But could all of his teachers and the entire scientific community be wrong? Years ago, as a young man, Heyerdahl had spoken to an old chief, the last man on the island, who still remembered the ancient legends. Now, many years later, Heyerdahl sits on the same spot with the old chief's son. Both had heard the old man tell stories of their ancestors and where they had come from.
Non-Tiki, he was both god and chief. It was Tiki who brought my ancestors to these islands where we live now. Before that, we lived in a big country beyond the sea.
When Heyerdahl asked the old chief where this country was, he pointed across the ocean to the east towards South America and told Heyerdahl that, in legend, his people had been brought across the water, out of the sunrise, by their ancient god Tiki. This was the breakthrough Heyerdahl had been looking for, a direct link between the two cultures. It was only later that he would learn of the legendary South American sun god called Non-Tiki, who, it was said, sailed west from South America across the Pacific, never to return. He was convinced that the two gods, Tiki in Polynesia and Non-Tiki in South America, were one and the same. In 1938, he returned to Norway, spending long hours in libraries, delving into the prehistory of early man, searching the two cultures, Polynesia and South America, for similarities, and gradually developing even more evidence that the original Polynesians had come from South America, not Asia. But no one believed him. His theory was rejected by the scientific establishment. Its premise, that ancient man sailed balsa wood rafts thousands of miles across the Pacific, was ridiculed. Early man could never have survived such a journey, he was told. In 1946, Heyerdahl came to New York, where he hoped to find members of the scientific community more open to his theory of Pacific migration. With little money and just 3 copies of his new scientific manuscript, he made the rounds of the top men in the field, with similar results. In scientific circles, Heyerdahl was a heretic. Worse yet, if he was right, then the so-called experts must all be wrong. Dr. Herbert Spindon, director of the Brooklyn Museum, refused to even consider his unorthodox theory.
Absolutely wrong.
But you haven't even read my arguments yet.
Arguments? You can't treat ethnographic problems like some sort of detective mystery.
Why not? I've based all the conclusions on my own observations and the facts that science has recorded.
But one thing we do know for certain is that none of the peoples of South America got over to the islands in the Pacific. Do you know why? They couldn't get there. They had no boats.
They had rafts. You know, balsa wood rafts.
Well, you can try a trip from Peru to the Pacific Islands on a balsa wood raft.
Unwittingly, Spindon made the suggestion that would change Heyerdahl's life. To prove a balsa wood raft capable of crossing the Pacific, Heyerdahl resolved to build a precise replica of the ancient craft and sail it from the coast of South America to Polynesia. It was an audacious undertaking. Most thought he would be sailing to certain death.
There was a drive within him, so nothing could have stopped him. I recall my mother once saying that your father, he experienced the Second World War as a personal insult. It was an obstacle to his plans. This just shows how focused he was on pursuing his theories.
Heyerdahl refused to give up. Desperately short of money, he couldn't even afford his apartment and moved into the Norwegian sailors' home in New York, where so many expert sailors, just returned from the war, were all convinced he was mad, that crossing the Pacific on a raft would be impossible. Finally, one man, a Norwegian engineer and sailor named Herman Watzinger, took him seriously. What's more, Watzinger asked to join the expedition. The Non-Tiki had its first crew member. But Heyerdahl still had no backers to pay for the journey. He took Watzinger to the Explorers Club in New York, where Heyerdahl was a member. Here, Danish polar explorer Peter Freuchen introduced Heyerdahl to a group of backers who promised to raise the money needed to finance the trip. This was the turning point. Heyerdahl began to assemble his crew. He reckoned it would take 6 people to sail a balsa wood raft. He wrote to an old friend, Eric Hasselberg, an artist who was an experienced navigator. Then to 2 wartime comrades, Torstein Rabi, who'd run a secret radio transmitter close to the German battleship Tirpitz, and Knut Haugland, who was a radio operator for the famous sabotage raid that destroyed the Nazi heavy water plant in Norway in 1943. For many in the team, the expedition seemed to fill a void at war's end.
I think the main thing was that I was very tired after the war. And I must say I was depressed. And when I was thinking over that I could get away from it all to first to South America and then to Polynesia, I think that was the main reason to do something which was not connected with war at all.
The sixth member to join the expedition later was Bengt Danielsson, a Swedish anthropologist. Although they all had specific skills, not one knew anything about sailing a balsa wood raft.
The men he took were not experienced seamen. Indeed, you couldn't find nowadays anyone experienced in using these log rafts. So although his men were not sailors, he didn't think that was very important, because the type of craft on which they would be sailing, he didn't think required sailors.
They had to be healthy, strong people who could take a tough turn. But for me, it was also very important that they had a sense of humor. I've always felt that when you really have trouble, if you can crack a joke and take it with a joke, you can solve many problems. And they had a terrific sense of humor. It was a fantastic group of boys to sail with.
As you will have read in the War Department's official release, which was published today, I'm intending to lead a scientific expedition across the Pacific next year.
It finally looked as though the Non-Tiki expedition was coming together. After years of hard work, Heyerdahl felt confident he now had both the crew and the backing he needed. But just in the midst of the press conference explaining his plans to cross the Pacific on a balsa wood raft, Heyerdahl received devastating news. His financial backers had withdrawn their support. It was Christmas in New York, but Heyerdahl was alone and facing the possibility of total failure. He confided his despair in a letter that was only recently revealed.
I've gone straight ahead as never before in my life. I've believed and willed, and the obstacles have collapsed, one after another, until today. There's one way forward and none back. I believe it will work out, and I'm determined that it shall work out. But I should like to remember this day, this struggle and this experience for the rest of my life, till the day I shall be forced to give up my very breath.
If you believe, you can do anything in the world if you just have a conviction strong enough. And I really did believe, and I worked it out.
Refusing to accept defeat, he gradually scraped together the money he needed. He'd weathered the storm, and now would begin the greatest adventure of his life. In January 1947, the Non-Tiki team arrived in Ecuador to harvest the fresh balsa wood logs in the precise manner of the ancient people before them. Next, they were floated down the river to the coast and on to the port near Lima. There, for the first time in hundreds of years, a balsa wood raft would be built on the coast of Peru, a precise reconstruction of the craft that sailed these waters so long ago. 9 of the thickest logs were chosen to form the actual raft, then thinner logs laid crosswise over them at intervals of about 3 feet. Native dockyard workers helped assemble the brand new prehistoric craft. Heyerdahl was determined to recreate the raft exactly in the manner of the early South Americans. With the logs in place, they were lashed together individually with hemp rope, each one firmly knotted by hand.
It was easy to piece together what these rafts were like. Some of the early voyagers had indeed even made good drawings of what they were like, every detail with the mast and sails and rigging. So we knew exactly what to do.
Boat builders and sailors alike advised Heyerdahl to use modern construction techniques. especially metal chains instead of hemp ropes to lash the logs together. But Heyerdahl insisted that they must build a precise replica of the ancient craft, otherwise his experiment would be invalid. However, naval experts were all convinced the raft could not possibly survive a Pacific crossing and advised him to abandon the expedition.
We were told, of course, that the balsa wood is fragile as cork, and the priests who came and gave us the Bible and said that we at least we should read that before we ended, and some come and said, think of your mother, how she will feel when she gets the news that you've gone down. So there were a lot of warnings.
Despite the predictions of disaster, the crew remained committed to Heyerdahl's dream.
Thor was convinced that these balsa log rafts worked, and that was the basis for his confidence. And when you have a leader with such confidence so evident, and such calmness so evident, that inspires the crew.
My men knew me well enough to know that I was not interested in committing suicide. They knew that I enjoy life very much, and that if I was sure that it would work, then they felt that the chances were big enough for them to join in.
Finally, they hauled the rectangular sail up on a yard made of 2 bamboo stems. The face of Non-Tiki was revealed. At last, they were ready to put to sea. Diplomats and journalists were invited to the christening of the raft. Gert Vold, the expedition secretary, was asked to do the honors.
I think it was the day or 2 days before they were leaving that Thor suddenly said, I want you to christen the raft with a coconut. Now, one thing I had learned from Thor was that nothing at all is impossible. So I didn't protest. I mean, it isn't easy to crack a coconut. But I used all the force I had, and milk was splattered all over.
The preparations were over. The Non-Tiki was ready to set sail. Most observers still felt the expedition was doomed, and the crew knew there was no hope of rescue if disaster struck. They would be completely on their own. On April 28, 1947, an ocean-bound tug towed the Non-Tiki out to sea. The crew rowed back to the raft, aware this would be their last human contact for a long time. As the tug sailed off, they were finally alone on the raft with only the waves for company. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the ultimate test of the Non-Tiki and her crew. Could they survive on a primitive raft in the vast Pacific?
The feeling wasn't too good. The current was very rough there, like a stream, and quite heavy wind, and we were not used to this kind of a craft, so it took some time before we learned how to adjust the sail and the centerboards and things.
The raft was put to the test almost immediately when the weather quickly turned rough. Huge waves came crashing down over the cabin. The men grabbed hold of whatever they could and could only hope to ride out the storm as the sea washed over them. With each new wave, they held their breath, not knowing if the raft would surface again. But each time, the Non-Tiki rose easily to the top of the wave, the water filtering through the logs, the raft floating safely atop the enormous swells.
When the waves started racing around you, it was quite an exciting feeling. At one moment you would see a shark in the water at eye level, and you think next it's falling down upon us, no? But next moment your raft is on top of that wave and you see the shark way down below you. It actually was sometimes so comical that we're just sitting laughing at the way this seemingly clumsy vessel took the seas.
To their great surprise and relief, the raft proved up to every challenge, its design even more ingenious than Heyerdahl had imagined. Each element seemed to have an unforeseen benefit, from the bamboo cabin to the balsa logs bound together by hemp ropes.
The very great advantage with the raft is, of course, that when a big wave came over the deck, the water would soon disappear down between the logs, and there was no hull which could be filled up by water, and so we could sink. We could actually not sink at all. I mean, not before all the logs had been completely waterlogged.
After a few days at sea, Heyerdahl wrote in his diary,
"We were now so accustomed to having the sea dancing around us that we took no account of it. What did it matter if we danced around a bit with 1,000 fathoms of water under us, so long as we and the raft were always on top? It was only here that the next question arose. How long could we count on keeping on top? It was easy to see that the balsa logs absorbed water.
I myself felt a bit insecure because you could feel the outside of the logs were getting swampy and moist. And when I thought that nobody looked at me, I took my knife, cut off a piece of the outer part of the wood, which was waterlogged, and dropped it in the ocean to see if it floated, and it was shocking to see that it slowly sank into the blue bottomless Pacific.
Now Heyerdahl understood why the experts predicted the raft could never cross the Pacific, because balsa absorbs water. How long would it take before all the logs were soaked through and sinking to the bottom?
But we had done like the Indians. We had gone into the jungle and cut the logs green with the sap inside. And the sap prevented the water to get further in. And it was lighter than the ocean water. So it was only the first couple of weeks that we absorbed, and from then on the logs were perfectly dry inside.
Eric took our position at noon and found that in addition to our run under sail, we had made a big deviation northward along the coast. We still lay in the Humboldt Current, just 100 miles from land. The great question was whether we should get into the treacherous eddies south of the Galapagos. This could have fatal consequences.
Fortunately, the wind and currents steered them clear of the turbulent waters. After nearly 21 days at sea, the raft finally began to head west and out of danger. One of the few pieces of modern equipment they had with them was a shortwave radio. The expedition's two operators, Knut and Torstein, sent daily reports from the raft.
The most difficult thing for us was movement of the raft, because when you sit there and shall send Morse, you know, and it's going up and down and that side.
I had daily radio contact with the raft. There were two, I think you call it in English, ham operators. There was one in Washington, his name I remember was Gene Melton, and he received the messages from a ham operator in Los Angeles.
When finally the Non-Tiki raft was on its way, I received a couple of telegrams from Thor and Eric. The second went something like this. Now on the journey through time following the sun, I send you and your family my warmest greetings from the ocean, as we have traveled 2,000 kilometers of our voyage. Greetings to all our friends, Thor.
This tangible proof from the middle of the Pacific gave reassuring hope to Heyerdahl's friends and family. Each man had his own sphere of daily responsibilities. Apart from the radio operators, Bengt was the steward and looked after supplies. Herman took scientific measurements. Eric was the navigator. And Thor was their leader and kept the ship's log. Together, they shared general chores like cooking or steering. They all had to learn to handle the raft in case of emergency. Virtually impossible to maneuver, the raft was at the mercy of the wind and the currents. It could neither stop nor turn around. They had some say in the direction it took, but by and large, nature was at the helm. It was only after the day's work was done, when the sea was calm, that the crew could relax. While the ocean rolled by beneath them, there was time to appreciate where they were. Inevitably, though, with 6 men living and working in such cramped quarters, problems would arise.
It's not the big things that causes problems when you sit together months on a raft. It's the little trivial thing where you're not expected. If somebody is spilling sugar into your sleeping bag or forgotten his fish hooks where you are sitting and things like that, that you may blow up uncontrolled. And we had a few instances like that.
Through it all, the expedition relied on Heyerdahl's leadership.
I could say shortly that he was a very good leader. He had the same kind of friendship to everyone. He was a good organizer, always thinking of not to forget anything. So we were comfortable with food and water.
I think from the army I learned that you shall treat your crew as equals and listen to them. And whenever there is a possibility to sit, if you have time, to sit like American Indians in the powwow and discuss what is the right solution now. Well, then we do it. And then the men feel that this is their expedition also.
The dangers on a balsa wood raft in the vast Pacific were everywhere. It became evident to the crew the second time 2 of them took out the rubber dinghy to make scientific measurements. The Non-Tiki was moving much faster than they had thought. Soon the 2 men were rowing desperately to catch up with the raft. If the wind had only been a little stronger, they would have been left behind in the vast Pacific. Everyone on board knew the stark truth. Anyone who got separated from the Non-Tiki was doomed. Whether in the dinghy or simply swimming alongside, they either stayed close by or would be left behind without hope of rescue. Another threat were the sharks. Someone was always on lookout, and the moment one was spotted, the crew had to scramble back on board. 26 days out, one seemed to challenge the raft itself.
I was sitting just aft here on the 2 logs you see over there, washing my shirt, and then suddenly a creature came up out of the sea. I saw an enormous head and a mouth and a dorsal fin high, nearly a meter high. I shouted so high they could hear it all over the Pacific. So everybody came running.
The monster turned out to be a whale shark, the largest of all fish in the sea, but far from the most ferocious. Yet at over 60 feet long and weighing several tons, the great fish dwarfed the raft. It was so large, the crew feared they'd be sunk simply if the shark rammed them. Eventually, one of them could bear the tension no longer and threw a hand harpoon at the great creature. It immediately dove into the deep. A few days later, in broad daylight, the nightmare they had all been dreading finally occurred. One of the crew lost his footing, fell overboard, and was immediately swept away. Amid the roar of the wind and the crashing of the waves, his head bobbing in the huge swells, his arms flailing, Herman was carried further and further away from the raft. Although an excellent swimmer, he was caught in the grip of a tenacious current. They tried throwing a lifebelt, but the wind blew it back. There seemed nothing anyone could do to rescue him, as they watched him drift further into the distance.
Knut came running out of the cabin and grabbed the lifebelt and jumped with it into the sea. And he swam towards Herman and Herman towards him.
At last we met, and he was very, very nervous, and I got him in front of me in the rope, and then we were dragged up then by the others.
I was literally shivering in my knees, shaking. That's one of the worst moments in my life. If we had lost one man there, it would be the end of... I don't know what I would have done.
3 months out, and still no sight of land. Had their calculations been off? Could they have missed the islands altogether? The crew was growing more anxious by the day. Supplies were limited. If they missed the Polynesian islands, there was no telling where the raft might be headed. Then, 93 days after leaving the coast of South America, the first indication of land. Birds flew overhead. They'd arrived in Polynesia. And yet, perhaps the most treacherous part of the journey still lay ahead, landing their raft amid the island's razor-sharp reefs. Powered by the same strong winds and currents that brought them all the way across the Pacific, they were now speeding towards the deadly coral.
The Tuamotu Islands, they're also known as the dangerous archipelago because of the tremendous surf. It's the largest surf in the world because the big ocean swells come all the way from South America with nothing to stop them.
They agreed that if they were wrecked, they would stay with the raft, or risk being crushed in the pounding surf or ripped to shreds against the reef. So they tied everything down and waited. The reef was dead ahead. Torstein made one last call on the radio. The final entry in the log sets the scene.
9:50, very close now. Drifting along the reef. Must pack up log now. All in good spirits. It looks bad, but we shall make it.
That was the worst nightmare, I think, in my life when we heard the thundering of the tremendous surf in front of us, and gradually were lifted up and thrown in, and then the next wave came over us. And instead of lifting us up as before, the wall was a glass wall taller than the top of the mast, and it fell down upon us. The raft was thrown up on the reef, but then again sucked back into the surf. Both Torstein and I, who were hanging outside, we were completely exhausted. And then finally, one wave so big, came so big that it threw us far up on the reef, and the raft got stuck on the corals.
I ran aft here and was standing here at the end of the cabin and holding myself in that rope you see there. And when we went down just before the reef, I saw this reef wall just in front of me. And when the raft moved up again through the wave, I jumped onto the reef with a long rope and ran on the reef, and then helped to drag the raft on the shore.
Once they were all safely ashore, the magnitude of their accomplishment began to sink in. They had succeeded in crossing the largest and most dangerous ocean on a primitive balsa raft, using only the winds and current. After so much fear and apprehension, they found themselves on a tropical island, the sands rimmed with palm trees, the sun shining bright on the clear blue water, anybody's definition of paradise.
I don't think any of us will ever forget the feeling after 101 days on the raft to wade, put our feet in dry, warm sand, and walk on the ground that didn't roll, and walk up and see the shade underneath the coconut palms. And as I looked around, I counted here were all my men. I had not lost a single man. That is when you fall down and bury your fingers in the sand and realize how close you were to have seen the end of earthly life there and then.
Heyerdahl now had the proof he needed. Never again could he be told the ancient South Americans could not have sailed across the Pacific to Polynesia. From the island, he and his crew were picked up and taken to Tahiti, where they boarded a liner for San Francisco and civilization. After their return from the South Seas, the Non-Tiki adventurers were showered with adoration everywhere they went. Non-Tiki fever swept the world. They were besieged by the press and honored by presidents and royalty.
The Non-Tiki expedition happened 2 years after war ended. 6 young men sail across the Pacific in the trade winds. They land on a Pacific atoll with attractive hula girls, with bananas and papayas and other tropical fruits, a blue lagoon. I mean, this is what the world was dreaming of in those days.
Of course, after the voyage, it was a tremendous surprise to me and all my men. The public interest is stimulated. I had expected that, of course, the scientists would be interested in seeing that the dogma they had all ascribed to was untenable, that it was possible, and that here I had an argument to continue work along the same line on ocean migrations of animals and men to Polynesia.
Heyerdahl prepared a detailed academic treatise explaining his theory of Pacific migration. And yet, when his more popular account of the voyage became an international bestseller, as Heyerdahl a media celebrity, some in the scientific community questioned his scientific credentials.
They bought the Non-Tiki book and said, he's just writing a travel story to make money. And they didn't realize that before I wrote that, I had written the scientific volume, but nobody wanted to publish it.
They didn't look at him as a scientist, they looked at him as a sailor. Oh, he's just proved that he's a good sailor. Well, this was absurd because he had a lot of scientific evidence behind his idea.
He had thrown a boulder into the calm pool of Pacific scientific research. Eminent scientists such as Alfred Matro, who had studied the subject for so long, were convinced that there was no way Heyerdahl could be right. If he was right, then they and their life's work were totally wrong.
The common thinking of the time was that if the oceans were a major barrier to disseminating populations throughout the world, and he looked at the oceans completely different, coming from a background of seafaring nations such as Norwegians and the Scandinavians and the Vikings, that the oceans are really avenues of transportation. So I think that he postulated this idea and he proved it, and I think he's been just having to prove it ever since.
During the course of the expedition, Heyerdahl shot 8,000 feet of movie film that was later made into a documentary, bringing the story of the Non-Tiki to an even wider audience, and creating even greater fame for Heyerdahl when the film won an Oscar in 1951.
The money that came in from the book and the film made it possible for me to organize larger expeditions. And in this way, I must say that I am very glad for the publicity, but in other ways, I would much have preferred to have been left a little more in peace, because the amount of correspondence coming in from all over the world, and of course all the fighting I had for many years.
In spite of Heyerdahl's remarkable voyage, the scientists remained skeptical. They wanted firm proof of an ancient South American presence in Polynesia. Heyerdahl turned to Easter Island, the nearest part of Polynesia to the coast of South America. As a boy, he'd seen illustrations of the mysterious stone statues. Now he wondered if they might not provide clues to the ancient people he was looking for. He knew that stone heads were also found in Mexico and on the Andean coast of South America, but nowhere else. If ancient South Americans had made this journey, surely they would have left other evidence of their culture on the island. In 1955, Heyerdahl used the money from the Non-Tiki book and movie to mount his first Easter Island expedition, accompanied by 5 professional archaeologists, as well as his second wife, Yvonne, and their small daughter. Until he arrived, Easter Island and its many mysteries had been unexplored. Few considered it a valuable site for archaeological research. Among his first revelations, the so-called stone heads, when unearthed, were in fact complete bodies. One statue, found in a squatting position, was of particular interest to Heyerdahl's longtime colleague, archaeologist Dr. Arne Skovvold.
The squatting statue was one of the most important finds we made there. It was buried in debris from the quarries. I dug it out myself. It was completely different from all the other statues on Easter Island, and there were no parallels to this statue anywhere else in Polynesia. The closest resemblance is to the works of the Tiwanaku civilization in Bolivia.
This was the first link to South American culture. The statue bears a strong resemblance to one in the Bolivian capital of La Paz. But soon, Heyerdahl would discover an even more important similarity between Easter Island and the early people of South America. He found rocks covered with ancient paintings of bird-like men holding eggs. The local population told him that, in the ancient tradition, a contest was held for the island's strongest man to collect a bird's egg from an offshore islet. This was the connection he'd been looking for. The Birdman cult was thought to be unique to ancient South American civilizations, a figure found prominently throughout the early dance and culture, yet nowhere else in the Pacific. Heyerdahl felt he had growing evidence that early South Americans had made the voyage to Easter Island. This was the key for Heyerdahl, finding similarities between Polynesia and South America that would prove an ancient connection between the two civilizations. During excavations of the stone statues, another mystery came to light. One of the statues was found to have a large 3-masted ship carved onto its breastplate. Islanders identified it as similar to the reed ships of legend their ancestors had used when they'd come to Easter Island years ago. But it was well known the most sophisticated early culture, the Inca, couldn't sail. So who were the ancient seafarers who left their mark on this remote island? Still today, the modern islanders use small floats made of reeds for fishing. Could their ancestors have made larger reed boats to sail the vast distances across the Pacific? Local fishermen in Peru also use reed boats similar to those on Easter Island. But Heyerdahl still had much work to do to prove that connection. All in all, Heyerdahl felt his Easter Island expeditions had been a tremendous success, turning up clear evidence an early South American people had visited here years ago. The question he now needed to answer was, who were the pre-Inca people who might have made that journey? Meanwhile, he began to suspect other ancient cultures could have put to sea in reed boats long before most historians believed possible. Over the years, he would sail the oceans of the world, replicating voyages of civilizations as far back as pre-biblical times, in order to establish how ancient man traveled the globe.
I think Heyerdahl was a pioneer in this whole aspect of experimental archaeology, especially when it comes to watercraft, because he has selected watercraft based on drawings or paintings made by prehistoric people. He's reconstructed the craft and then demonstrated its seaworthiness by sailing it.
The ocean is not a barrier. The ocean helps you across. You have to struggle hard to go through a continent by foot, whereas in the ocean you are sailing and your food provider, you fish and you collect rain, and with time, with no effort, you get across the largest world oceans.
His voyages captivated the imagination of people all over the world. But still, in the halls of academia, his expeditions were seen more as publicity stunts than scientific experiments.
Roads to specific destinations on Oahu. The active imaginations of explorers, would-be explorers, historians, writers, thinkers, savants, and especially charlatans have sprinkled over 100 years of publications with conjecture on
He was still a heretic, his theories still unorthodox, and threatening to the work of many scientists. Within the scientific community, academics disapproved of Heyerdahl's high profile and his great popularity through books and film.
Congress after another, and everybody, they agree.
I'm kind of
no, but let us agree on one thing,
right.
and that is that we stop, or you stop attacking me.
Let's you and I agree to talk when there's not a camera over your shoulder.
Okay.
But you have been at that team all the time.
Well, I don't think he relishes controversy so much, but it is, as I've tried to tell him over and over again, that he depends on it, because it's this controversy that gives him publicity. And publicity is what he needs to finance his projects. So he can't live without the controversy. He should be very grateful to his opponents.
In 1987, Walter Alva, a Peruvian archaeologist, made an intriguing discovery: ancient gold masks that might provide the final clue in Heyerdahl's lifelong quest.
That really shows that
The masks had piercing blue eyes inlaid with lapis lazuli that was only found 2,000 kilometers to the south along the coast.
contact with very distant countries all over South America.
Soon another mask was uncovered with tropical shells that could only be found on the coast of Ecuador, far to the north. These precious materials could only have been obtained after a long sea journey. Could they have been made by the ancient seafarers that Heyerdahl had been searching for? But Alva's greatest revelation was still to come.
We came to Tucumán just as the sun set. And when I saw these enormous structures shining golden in the evening sun, for a moment I was sure I was dreaming. I mean, on this planet full of tourism, it isn't a tourist site, it isn't on the map, and the government and nobody have ever been speaking about it. And I felt that if this is untouched, we may be able to find answer to many questions.
Hidden in these barren hills could be the missing link Heyerdahl had been searching for his entire life. Tucumán, Peru's lost city, was a complex of 26 step pyramids that had lain forgotten for centuries. Heyerdahl hoped that at last he'd come upon the pre-Inca race capable of navigating from the coast of South America to the islands of Polynesia. Here, in this remote part of Peru, Heyerdahl built himself a traditional adobe brick house, the Casa Non-Tiki, and began to raise money and international interest for a proper archaeological excavation of the site. Riding to the site each morning, he took a very personal interest in the excavations. Work began in 1988, and immediately an avalanche of fascinating artifacts came pouring out of the eroded pyramids, mounds, and cemeteries.
Buenos días, Hugo.
Buenos días, Thor.
¿Cómo está?
Bien.
Sí. ¿Cómo va el trabajo?
Bien, avanzando un poco,
sí,
encontrando nuevas cosas.
¿Qué ha encontrado?
Esto.
Ay, ay, ay. This is interesting. This is Inca.
I think so.
It's the motive.
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
motif, the geometric motif.
Yes, that means we have many
Inca
sequences. This is the latest, no?
Uh-huh.
And we have Chimu before this.
Chimu, Lambayeque, maybe Wari.
Yeah.
And these things Inca.
More and more, Heyerdahl uncovered artifacts from the pre-Inca culture here that were strikingly similar to objects found on Easter Island. Each discovery provided even more evidence that the early people of South America made the journey just as Heyerdahl had imagined. One of the unique features of Easter Island was a double-bladed paddle used ceremonially by the islanders in their traditional dances. Now here in Tikume, Heyerdahl found a miniature silver paddle, the only other example of such a paddle anywhere. But could this ancient South American race have sailed to Easter Island? Finally, it was in 1992 that Heyerdahl made the most exciting discovery of the entire excavation. They revealed the top of a temple wall that was covered with an ancient relief. To their trained eyes, the motif was very familiar. It was the key to the puzzle Heyerdahl had been searching for all his life.
These are typical representations of seabirds. Also, see the wave pattern that's associated with it.
And you even have it on the pots, don't you?
On the pots, and also sometimes associated with fish on the pots. There's no question as to the identity of these birds as being seabirds.
All along, he'd been missing one crucial piece of evidence. Because the Inca couldn't sail, he needed to find an earlier culture that went to sea. This relief from an ancient temple wall contained all the information he needed to be certain the people of Tikume were the civilization he'd been seeking for so long. What's more, here was an exact copy of the Easter Island birdmen.
We found temple reliefs of big reed ship with bird-headed men sitting, and with rows of crouching bird-headed men with an egg in the hand sitting below. This excavation shows without any question at all where the birdman cult came from, because in Peru it was widespread all over the continent, although it had a concentration in Tikume.
The Non-Tiki expedition had shown it was possible to sail a balsa raft from South America to Polynesia. On Easter Island, he had found evidence that a South American culture had visited that remote part of the world. But who those people were remained a mystery. Now, to complete the puzzle, Tikume provided proof of a South American civilization capable of making that treacherous journey so long ago.
After 5 years of major archaeological excavations in Tikume, I find for myself that this has closed the ring. I was back where I started by showing that science was wrong when they said that the balsa raft was not seaworthy. And my first expedition was to show that such a voyage could be done. And here in these excavations, we reveal that these people were navigators. They actually had a maritime culture with contact all the way up and down the coast of South America and as far out as to Easter Island.
The archaeological finds at Tikume have finally vindicated the theory Heyerdahl sought to prove for so long. His life has been an ongoing adventure, a detective story told in epic journeys many said could never be made.
I hope that my father will be remembered for challenging conventional science, showing that it's possible to achieve results through unorthodox methods, and to prove to young people that everything is possible if you just put the enthusiasm and power into it.
I think he'll be remembered as an extraordinarily courageous man. For one thing, he not only had the courage to face the elements, to face nature, he also had the courage to stand up to criticism without anger, without sarcasm, without even any outward show of terrible indignation. He simply bore the criticism and just steadfastly kept going to find the truth.
When I think back at a long life in science, I can see that I managed to do one thing. I have stirred up dead water. I have made people discuss and test dogma and start rethinking when it comes to the ocean.
Presentation of the adventurers was made possible by the annual financial support of viewers like you.
This is PBS.